This is Diabetes Connections with Stacey Sims.
This week, on this last day of 2024, a look ahead to 2025. What will the new year bring for diabetes technology, research, and practical stuff that we'll actually use? A fun conversation about what could happen in the next 12 months. This podcast is not intended as medical advice. If you have those kinds of questions, please contact your healthcare provider. Welcome to another week of the show, the last show of 2024. As you know, we aim to educate and inspire about diabetes with a focus on people who use insulin. I'm your host, Stacey Sims, and I want to first wish you a happy new year. This episode is going live on December 31st of 2024, so you're probably listening into January, I would assume. But regardless of when you are listening, I really hope that you're having a good, healthy start to the new year. And, I don't like to focus on resolutions and that kind of thing in this show, but I do like to take a look ahead every year. I'm going to link up our last couple of prediction episodes, from last year and the year before, and you can see how well we did. It's an interesting look at what we were waiting for. This year's show is less about predictions and more about kind of what we're looking forward to, what we are keeping an eye out in the next 12 months. And I'm joined here by Dr. David Ahn, who many of you may know from Instagram, where he goes by On Call, AHNCALL, On Call. So I will link him up so you can learn more about him. He's an endocrinologist. He does not live with diabetes. And I've had different guests over the years for this kind of prediction show, patients, CDCES folks. I just like to kind of get different perspectives. I'm asking about this in the Facebook group. I'd love to know what you are looking for and looking forward to in 2025. Of course, this conversation went very long. There was a lot on our list and we didn't get to everything. I just want to spotlight here that something we did not talk about that I am definitely keeping an eye on in the new year is Afrezza for kids. Mankind said in the last couple of days that it is talking to the FDA in the early part of 2025 and hoping to submit inhaled insulin for the pediatric community, which is going to be big news. And of course, the use of AI in diabetes health, it's everywhere in healthcare. It's just everywhere. So we didn't spend a lot of time talking about that. And Dexcom just announced this week that they have incorporated AI into the Stell platform. That's the CGM for people who do not use insulin. I could keep going and do another hour on everything we didn't touch on. And please stick around after our conversation. I have a question for you as you listen to the podcast. It's about the podcast. We have a big milestone coming up. I'll tell you all about it after my conversation with Dr. David Ahn. Dr. David Ahn, welcome to Diabetes Connections. Appreciate you spending some time with us today.
Thanks for having me on. Your podcast is probably one of the first online presences I found when I was kind of exploring this whole space. So it's a real privilege to be talking with you.
Well, thank you. That means a lot. I really appreciate it. Before we jump in, would you mind just telling me a little bit about what you do, what kind of patients you see, a little bit about your background?
I am an adult endocrinologist. I'm the chief of diabetes services at Hoag Hospital, which is a healthcare system in Orange County, California. So I'm the director of their diabetes center. We have two locations, one in Irvine and one in Newport Beach. And in my clinical practice, I see patients with diabetes and obesity. My particular area of interest is diabetes technology and primarily type 1 diabetes, but I do see patients with type 2 diabetes, type 1, prediabetes, and obesity. And so that's what I love helping people with. And then also I oversee clinical research here and oversee some of the health policy with respect to diabetes for Hoag, the healthcare system at large.
And you find some time somewhere in that to make videos and engage people on social media so they can learn more about diabetes.
That is true. And funny story there is oftentimes I'm recording at 1 a.m. because I get really embarrassed. So I wait till my wife and the kid goes to sleep. And then I put down the towel under the door and then I start recording. So if my eyes are bloodshot in some of my videos or my iPhone screen says 1:41, it's usually 1:41 a.m. and not p.m.
I totally understand that. There's something really embarrassing about the people that friends and family listening to stuff and seeing videos, but strangers can look at it. I still have that disconnect. That's really funny.
Yeah. And the irony there is also too, I think even like the dietitians and doctors like on my team probably don't even watch my content on Instagram. So it's really funny. It's like, yeah, your closest friends, like, they're unimpressed. But that's okay. That's how life is, right?
So, I've been doing the show for a very long time, almost 10 years now. And I like to do at the beginning of the year, not necessarily predictions. We've tried that, but more along the lines of what are we watching? And this is the first year in a long time that I can remember that there aren't obvious and big FDA approvals. We're not waiting for the Dexcom G7. We're not waiting for Omnipod 5 integration with the iPhone. Not that everybody's done with everything, but as we start off here, I am really struggling to think of anything that I am waiting for my son's care, except, and this isn't even on the table yet, except more approval for GLP-1s for people with type 1. We'll get to that a little bit later, but that's the only one I can think of, really.
I think that's a great actual representation of what this year is going to be like, in my opinion. In that, you're right. I don't think there's going to be a groundbreaking new product that, shakes the world. But I think it's going to be the evolution of things that are already out that will be really fascinating. So, one way I put it is I'm curious to see how much disruption takes place. And sorry to use a buzzword so early, but in the type 1 diabetes space, it's been dominated by Dexcom, right? On the CGM space. And Dexcom is a great product, but as your viewers probably know, the Libre 3 Plus is now FDA approved to be used in pumps. And it's a great product too. I think it's kind of flown under the radar for a long time. And I know they're really working on beefing up their partnerships with other pump companies. And similarly, there's an FDA approved pump already called Sequel Twist, which is approved, but not yet on the market. So it's not new in the sense that we already know it's approved, but it has not yet come on the market. And it's hard for new pump companies to enter the diabetes space and succeed. I think they have a compelling product. So I'm really curious to see if they're able to kind of break into this market that's very dominated right now by 3 companies, Insulet, Tandem, and Medtronic. And Eversense is a CGM manufacturer that also got their newest product already FDA approved. It's already out, the Eversense 365, and they're in the same boat as Libre, where it is capable to be integrated with insulin pumps, but they don't have any insulin pump partners yet. So I'm really curious to see if kind of the old boys club of, Medtronic, Dexcom, Abbott, Tandem, Omnipod, if there is any kind of, I wonder if it's that same 5 kind of running the type 1 diabetes space a year from now.
That's a good question. I want to jump in. Let's talk a little bit more about Libre.
Okay.
Because we've seen this finally, a little bit of interoperability, right? Where you can tell the insulin pump, I'm going to use a G7, I'm going to use a G6 of the Dexcom, but I'm also going to use a Libre. And there does seem to be, though, a supply issue, at least with the 3. Do you know if that's...
It's something I have definitely heard of. It's funny. I was actually literally texting with a friend of mine yesterday. She was asking me the exact same question. She's an endocrinologist. And I think the messaging has been really confusing. So basically what happens is Libre is in the midst of transitioning from the Libre 3 to the Libre 3 Plus. And functionally, they are very, very similar. So primarily, like from going from one sensor to the next, really the only noticeable difference would be it's a 14-day sensor versus a 15-day sensor. Beneath the surface, there are a lot of important modifications. So now it's less susceptible to interference from vitamin C. The Libre 3 Plus is able to integrate with insulin pumps, which is huge for us, of course. But noticeably, there's not a huge difference like right off the bat. So what's happening is a lot of patients have prescriptions for the Libre 3. They're going to their pharmacy and the pharmacist or whoever's behind the counter is saying, okay, we don't have this in stock. And then that's the end of the conversation.
Right.
But they're not saying, hey, we have 3 pluses in the back. And so that message is kind of stopping there. And a lot of endocrinologists, we're not getting that message back. So then it kind of stops. And then I'll have patients come back finally, at their visit and they're like, oh, I haven't been able to be on the Libre. And I'm like, oh, they should have told you, or I wish I knew so that we could have just sent over a prescription for a 3 plus. Now the 3 plus availability also isn't perfect, but I've heard that the Libre 3 plus availability, it's more just like you might have to wait a day or 2 for them to resupply versus with the Libre 3, because they're not making as many new ones. I think those shortages are seeming more permanent.
That's a great
so my
point.
recommendation to your viewers would be to check and see if they're getting a prescription for the 3 plus, because there's really no reason to stay on the 3 when the 3 plus is out.
Got it. Okay. And that's happened to friends of mine. We don't have it.
Yeah,
and
my patients too. Yeah.
Okay. Let's stay with CGM for just another minute or 2. the partnerships that some of these companies are doing with other devices, I think is really interesting. We've seen like Fitbit integrated with Dexcom, and I'm sure we'll be seeing more of that. But what do you make of the Dexcom and Oura partnership? Because you're a doctor, and I got to tell you, maybe I should not get ahead of myself in this way, but like I look at the Oura ring and I think, really? Like, are we really getting information from that? But this is a big partnership.
It is. And I think the press release, I don't know how your viewers felt or you feel, but like, I feel like when you see the announcement, you think it's bigger than it is. And what I mean by that is, when I saw the press release come in, I was like, oh, wow, this is crazy. And my mind goes to things like, are you going to see your CGM number on your ring? Which of course makes no sense because there's no screen on the ring. Or you kind of think like, are they going to sample glucose from your finger? Which once again, of course, makes no sense, right? But like, those are the types of things my mind kind of jumped to immediately when you think of an integration. But once you read the press release, you realize that really it's Dexcom investing in a smaller company that they think is going to be successful, right? That's why they invest. And two, it really is just a data sharing agreement. So it's going to be very similar, I think, to what you were talking about with the Fitbit agreements in the past, where I think now your glucose data might be one panel in your Oura Ring app. So now you get, instead of just like your recovery score and your sleep score, now you're going to get like a metabolic score for your glucose performance. But so I actually am wearing one. Your audio viewers probably can't tell. I purchased one and I've been wearing it for the past week, just kind of see what that experience might be like. There's no integration yet, but I agree with you. I've been pretty underwhelmed. I think it's very much a wellness product. It's kind of fascinating, but it's very much also reading the tea leaves, literally, right? Like, who's to say that, your heart rate variability through your finger is really correlating to your recovery. So I think it's fun if you're interested in these types of devices. I think you'll have a good time looking at it, but I think it's very much a wellness product versus a medical product. Yeah, I think that's the biggest difference. I'm really curious to see where it goes from now. One thing I will add, though, since your audience is primarily type 1 diabetes, is that I unfortunately don't think there's going to be much of a role for type 1 diabetes in this. If you read the press release, it seems very heavily coded towards being a Stell integration, which is their over-the-counter direct-to-consumer product. There might still be some data sharing. If you're wearing a G7, I think your glucose data will probably still pour into the Oura app and vice versa. But I think the integrations are going to be primarily focused around wellness and like metabolic health, whatever that means, versus, hey, this is going to help your type 1 diabetes algorithm on your automated insulin delivery system. I don't think there'll be any of that going on.
Well, maybe it'll be a long-term future thing, because I agree with you. I have a bed. My bed measures my sleep. And makes me laugh because I'm like, I know I slept like crap last night. Oh, let me see my score. Oh, it's a crappy score. Oh, I wake up. Oh, I got a great night's sleep. And my score reflects that. So I think it's, to give Oura some credit, perhaps we're in the beginning stages here.
Correct.
But at the same time, I'm not too surprised to find out, as you say, it's more of a wellness push. But let's talk about Stell.
Yeah.
Because this made a big splash, both Libre and Dexcom, or Abbott and Dexcom, having over-the-counter products. And I think Abbott will be putting theirs out in 2025, more, commercially.
Agreed, yeah.
Dexcom's is out. I actually wore it. First CGM I ever tried. Again, not a lot of surprise because my A1C, I'm so sorry, my A1C is 5.2 and I never went above 140.
Right.
So, and it was an interesting look, and I'm still putting videos out about it. But I do think that this is going to be very, very big for people with type 2 and prediabetes. And I'm sure you're seeing that in your clinics.
Yeah. I mean, I think because I see patients who are already self-motivated, right? They're coming into an endocrinologist office. We've already been using CGM pretty aggressively in that patient population, even if they're not on insulin. The Freestyle Libre with the prescription, right? And as a prescriber, obviously all my patients can have a prescription, have been able to use the Libre 2 or 3 with at a $75 a month price point with a coupon. I guess in that sense, my interaction with patients hasn't changed dramatically. That being said, I totally agree with you. Now that there's no need for a prescription, I think it really is a great product for people that are, maybe they're just being cared for by their primary care provider, or maybe they know they're in that pre-diabetic range or have risk, or have diabetes but aren't on aggressive medications. Those patients, I think, are ideally suited because they don't even really have to involve a healthcare provider. They can order it, get some information on their own, and make lifestyle modifications as a result.
I'm burying the lead here a little bit. We should have started talking about CGM by the FDA submission that is hanging out there, and that is the Dexcom 15-day.
Right.
So this would bring it in line with Libre. This 15-day Dexcom is something that I think a lot of people have been looking for.
I think so, because primarily, as you know, these sensors in general are not that accurate in the first 12 to 24 hours, right? So if you're extending the life of your sensor from 10 to 15 days, that means, oh gosh, I think 33% less of those if you add it up throughout the course of a year. So that's 5 more days where you can be highly confident in the accuracy of the sensor. My only concern, and this applies to its device agnostic, is that for people that have issues with the sensors lasting long enough or falling off, it just makes it harder to deal with the insurance companies or to deal with the companies to get a replacement. But thankfully, I haven't heard that many complaints. And I do think the newer versions of the Dexcom G7 have seemed to be stickier. So that's a good thing.
Yeah. And they've, over the years, boy, we've done so many shows on the balance of stickier but non-irritating.
Yeah.
Right. And the difference between pediatric patients who tend to knock stuff off more and also have more volatile blood sugars. And the companies are well aware of these things. But I agree with you. It's a concern, especially I think of parents of young kids who tend to like swim and bathe and get, everything's all wet and then they're sweating and knocking things off. It's a different, and I've talked to Dexcom about this. It's a different experience, adult to peds.
Yeah.
So hopefully they'll take that under consideration and replace when they need to replace.
Of course.
And then Eversense. I think they need to find a pump partner. I'm a little worried about them. They need to find a pump partner, right?
Yeah, I 100% agree. I mean, I think, I've actually been a supporter of their company in the sense that I insert their sensor since their launch, right? So it was a 90-day sensor. Your viewers may not even remember. So it had to be changed 90 days. I believe the first system was a 2 calibration a day system, right? Which is,
so was Dexcom, though, if you remember.
Yeah, right, for sure. And so, I think it's funny because I think the 365 product, which just got FDA approved and just came out, finally puts to rest essentially every question that people have had, right? It's a once a year procedure change, which is now, that's manageable, I think, for most people. The once weekly calibration schedule, I think, is very doable. Now it can integrate with pumps. And so I agree. Like, I think they've answered all the questions, right? All the people that were naysayers or hesitant would say like, oh, but what about this? But what about that? And so all those whatabouts are kind of addressed. But now the challenge is finding the pump partner to really prove that it works. Because now, 6 years ago when it was a 90-day product, like not many people were on automated insulin delivery systems. Now it's kind of like, who's not? Like, if you're not, only the people that don't want to be on a pump are not on automated insulin delivery system. So they really do need to find a pump partner. But it's funny, I've actually been thinking about making a series of videos kind of cheekily, but almost like a letter to the CEO of every company with like a sales pitch for why they should integrate with Eversense. Because my fear, and I've kind of alluded to this earlier with like the old boys club comment, that like, in a way, those 5 companies are very happy with there not being any other players in the market, right? Why would they want to share the market share? And so I worry that it kind of stifles innovation and it stifles competitiveness and stifles choice for our patients. So I think that's one of the reasons I'm so outspoken in a way for Eversense. Not that I think every person should be on an Eversense. I think Dexcom and Libre are fantastic products, but it's just that I also don't want to see them not make it just because they're not given a chance. Because I think it's a really important alternative for people who do have really, really sensitive skin, or who just don't find their experience with the traditional form factor to be working for them. So it really is an important product that needs to be an option. And it does get me frustrated sometimes when I think about the future and I worry that they might not end up getting a pump partner, and it's just not right.
Yeah. Well, when you think about when my son was diagnosed, there were more pumps on the market, which is crazy to think about.
Out there. Yeah.
The Cosmo, the Deltec. I mean, it was 2006 or 7 that we started looking at insulin pumps. So it's nice to see more come on the market. But before we talk about those pumps, let's just wrap up CGM stuff here by talking about the Medtronic. They got Simplera approval this year,
Yep.
but I don't know, how do we say this? The proprietary agreement with Abbott.
Yeah.
So Abbott's going to make a new CGM, but for Medtronic for that ecosystem. That's my understanding.
Yeah. I mean, by all estimations, I think what's essentially going to happen is they're going to release, Abbott is going to make a version of the 3 Plus that is essentially co-branded with Medtronic. So it might be called, the Medtronic Libre or something, or like the Medtronic, I don't know, insert your name, but it's very clearly going to be a Libre 3 Plus, just branded by Medtronic.
Do you think that's for the type 2 community only, or do you think it'll take the place of Simplera?
I think it's very much going to be it's going to be essentially a direct competitor or alternative, I should say, to the Simplera. I think it's a great decision because I think Simplera is going to be a great sensor, but it just allows them to have extra arrows in the quiver, right? Because I think the Libre 3 Plus, which it's going to be based on, in my opinion, it's a fantastic sensor. It's the smallest sensor on the market. Right now, it's 15 days already. I think it's just as accurate as the Dexcom G7. I think the signal strength might be better than the Dexcom G7. So I think it at least answers the question. I think for so many years with Medtronic pumps, it's always been, but their CGM is a little bit behind. Right. If it was just a Simplera coming out, it would be, the way I described it was like, it would be in the same generation. Like at least it doesn't feel like, 20th century, but it's still it would have been like a slight tier below Libre 3 Plus and Dexcom G7 in that it's a 2-hour warm-up, 7-day sensor. So if they can truly get the Libre 3 Plus on their side as an option, I think it fully closes down all those questions of, do they have a top-of-the-line sensor?
Okay, let's switch back to the pumps we had mentioned. The Twist and Beta Bionics.
Yep.
The Beta Bionics came out this year. I mean, people are wearing it. It's available. The Twist will be available commercially in 2025. Let's start with Beta Bionics because they're still in and this is not their words, these are mine. They're in kind of phase 1 of what they ultimately want that product to be, right?
For
Dual chamber pump, glucagon, and insulin together. The hardware, as listeners are very familiar with, it already has the chamber for the glucagon, but it's certainly not coming out like that this year. What do you see for Beta Bionics, other than them, I think, really doing a good job of explaining what makes them different?
And with all these startups, I kind of see them in the same vein as Eversense, where I think it's important to have options on the market. But my fear is that they need to stay alive to evolve their product and find their ideal product market fit. I think with the Beta Bionics program, I think the algorithm is unique, right? In the sense that you don't have any settings and things like that to adjust really other than weight and target. And so I think that concept works well for certain segments of the population. The hardest challenge that they have is I think it works well for a market that hasn't yet been sold on wearing a pump, right? Because it's like the people that have already transitioned to using an automated insulin delivery system, they often feel like they're losing functionality by going to the iLet, right? Because you're taking away options that they used to have. So what they have the gargantuan task of convincing people that have been hesitant to go on a pump to finally go on a pump, right? So in a way that the market is large because they could theoretically take over everybody else who hasn't been on a pump yet, but it also is the hardest job to convince them because there's a reason why these people haven't been on it. So they kind of have that tall task. And then I do think that their plan to eventually be a dual hormonal pump is really fascinating too, because when that comes out, then maybe those people that are AID users might switch over. So they need to stay alive long enough to get there. But it's hard because, like I said, they're going after a market that exists on paper, but is very difficult to capture. My personal opinion is I think it's a great pump for primary care providers who might be in areas where there are less endocrinologists who kind of are hesitant to manage type 1, but those patients are going to be better served by an automated insulin delivery system than by pens alone. So if I were their marketing officer, I would focus on primary care providers in kind of like the less densely populated parts of the country. But that's not my job at the same time.
That's a free idea. I think
that's for free.
I agree. And then the Twist, what's fascinating about this is it's got the Tide Pool software. Sorry, Twist, your hardware is amazing too. Very unique.
Right.
But I think the people that we're talking to on this podcast have been waiting to see that Tide Pool software in action. My question, I don't know if you have an opinion on this. My question is, how quickly will they be able to update? Because the DIY software, that type
Right. It's a couple versions ahead now.
It's right. It has moved ahead. So I'm curious what that might look like in the next year or two.
I mean, I think that's a valid concern in the sense that it's not going to be updated nearly as frequently. I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if it's once every 18 months to 24 months. I have no inside knowledge, but that's the reality, right? When you look at Medtronic, Omnipod, Tandem, they don't update their algorithms much at all. Probably less, I mean, maybe every 3 to 5 years, to be honest. I think it will be much, much, much slower in that regard. But thankfully, the version that they forked to get FDA approved does have at least most of the modern features on them. So I think it's a good build, and I think users will like it. And it's a way to get a really good algorithm in a company supported way. And I do think for many people, DIY is a little bit scary. And so I think the sequel twist will be a great option. And what I love about, I feel like I am kind of hammering on the same theme, but like, I just love that sequel twist was able to come on the market and, one, potentially disrupt, and two, give a voice to the tide pool loop algorithm, right? Because the tide pool loop algorithm, a lot of people don't know this, was FDA approved like 18 months before that partnership was announced. It got FDA approved, but it got left off the altar because their pump partners backed out once the FDA approval came out. And so it was literally FDA approved, but no pump company was willing to partner with them. So that is to Sequel's great benefit, because Sequel came out, entered the market, and they're like, hey, there's this awesome algorithm on the market, or FDA approved, but no one's commercialized it yet. And so that's my fear of what might happen to Senseonics and Eversense, is that it's just going to sit there and pump partners are going to pretend it doesn't exist. My secret hope is that Sequel will kind of do the same thing with Eversense and be like, hey, like, I see you in the corner, like, let's dance a little bit,
Yeah, I
That's
like
my
that.
hope.
It's interesting because I can share that without any real knowledge of it. I know it's interesting because I know that Sequel is trying to do things differently.
Mhm.
And, all these companies come out and say, oh, we're going to be brand new and no one's ever seen anything like this. But internally, at least the way they're trying to launch, they are really trying to figure out how better to teach about pumping and how to reach people who may not have considered it before. They're really trying to use they have so many people from the DIY community who work there now.
Sure.
It's
Yeah.
been really interesting to watch. And, and Beta Bionics has, with Ed Damiano, this person, this pioneer who has been very outspoken, very much the face of that company, looking at these two companies in slightly different way. I wonder if that will serve us.
I am very optimistic. When I say that, I don't mean that they'll succeed, because it's hard. It's so hard to enter the pump market. But I have reasons for hope in the sense that kind of the opposite scenario with Beta Bionics is the loop algorithm has the most levers available as an algorithm, right? It has the most configurability. So I think there are going to be a good amount of people that are on other systems or that have been eyeing wearing a pump that think, oh, I can have more configurability. Let's try out that system. And when I first heard about the FDA approval of the Sequel Twist, because it kind of came out of nowhere, initially I was like, okay, great, another pump company. What are they actually going to bring to the table? And I didn't know Dean Kamen's name. I didn't recognize his name, but I first heard he was the inventor of the Segway. So I was like, okay, great. Like some rich inventor guy who thinks he knows what he's doing and he's going to change diabetes, right? Like that happens all the time. However, when I heard his backstory about how his first major invention was the insulin pump in 1980, I was like, wow, that means this guy actually understands what insulin delivery is like. And so once I kind of heard that backstory, there's so many cool things about the loop algorithm and the loop story about them being left at the altar. I am very excited and eager just to see disruption in the market and to see them do well.
Just some funny inside baseball. I saw that pump, the Twist pump, or what became it in 2018.
Oh, wow.
When they were partnering with Lilly, I believe, at the time.
Okay.
And
wow.
DECA, and they had a whole bunch of bloggers and influencers. We were not allowed to take any pictures.
Oh, wow.
But it's very similar. And so it was one of those things, like you said, wow, it actually came out. So
yeah. I mean, you've been in the space long enough. There's so much stuff we see, so many ideas that just never come to market, or you see them come out so much later. Yeah. I mean, the pace of FDA approval, development, commercialization, it just takes forever. Like I remember, like you, seeing the Mobi in like 2018, and I was actually excited for it because
Yeah.
it's so small and so
The
cute.
T-Sport.
Yeah, exactly, right? It was a T-Sport, you're right. And to think that it took like 6 years beyond that. And by the time I saw it, I'm sure it was like 5 years after they had started building it. So it's just so crazy how long these things take to make.
But that's a perfect jump. I want to talk about the Mobi because we sent each other emails on what we're going to talk about today. And
Yeah.
I got to tell you, you sent me something that, first of all, it made me laugh, but I hadn't heard about the Toby.
Yeah, yeah.
So I know Tandem is working on tubeless. They shared their pipeline a couple of years ago. But is the tubeless Mobi, are people really calling this Toby, or did you make that up?
I did not make it up. I wish I did. My friend who actually works at Tandem was telling me that she's trying to make it stick. But I think it's amazing. I think they should even like market it that way. But I love that name. But yeah, so the tubeless Mobi. And the really cool thing is, as far as I understand it, is that it would be available immediately for everybody on the Mobi, and it would just be a different cartridge, right? So the way that the Mobi works, it's just like a little mini insulin pump. So right now there's a cartridge with a tubing connector at the end, but basically what would happen is the cartridge would have a directly inserting end. So
like an infusion set right on the...
Yeah, sorry, an infusion set, like right on the cartridge itself. So it would go directly in. So it basically is kind of like, you would kind of have a feel much closer to the Omnipod or an adhesive patch. Because right now, as your users probably know, if you do use their adhesive sleeve, it's a little bit less elegant, or a good amount less elegant than the Omnipod 5 with like the pigtail tubing and things like that. So I think they're hoping to kind of get rid of that whole pigtail set and just have it be able to go straight in from the infusion set, from the cartridge directly.
So again, I know as you're listening, we don't work for Tandem. We don't, we're sharing what we've heard. But I do have to say, David, I don't think they can call it Toby. I think Toby is the name of the turtle that Omnipod uses as its mascot.
Oh, how funny.
I'll have to look that up, but I think that's the case.
That's smart preventative marketing by Omnipod. Yeah.
Okay. I'm sure we've missed a lot. I'm sure we've missed something, CGMs and pumps, but we're going to get way too long. I started out mentioning GLP-1s for people with type 1. And let's just zoom out on that a little bit, because it's really fascinating to think about how we're seeing what we used to think of as type 1 stuff for people with type 2. We've already mentioned CGM, and maybe some type 2 stuff for people with type 1. But talk to me a little bit about what you're looking for. I mean, I worry that there's just not enough research for tirzepatide, because basically I want my son to take that. And it's it's impossible to get coverage for it. So do we think that this is going to be is there enough research happening?
There is, actually. So that's the good news. I expect, hint, hint, that there will probably be publications coming in the near future, at least position statements or expert opinion articles written, basically kind of creating, it's not like scientific trial data, but basically people saying, we are a lot of diabetes experts and we feel that this is a good option for people with type 1 diabetes. And at least it kind of starts discussion. It starts, then you can kind of go to your insurance companies and cite this paper, and it kind of continues, it advances the discussion. In addition, I wouldn't be surprised if these companies like Novo, who makes Ozempic or semaglutide, and Lilly, who makes tirzepatide or Mounjaro, if these companies are not starting to gather data or do clinical trials to show that it is helpful in people in type 1 diabetes. On one hand, the reality is these companies are just nailing it, right? They're selling every pen that comes off the manufacturing lines. So there's not urgency in that sense, but I think they understand it. And in the type 1 diabetes endo circles that I run in, including a lot of these major diabetes centers across the country, we very highly regard the use of Ozempic and Mounjaro in people with type 1 diabetes. I regularly offer it to my patients. But like you said, the challenge really is affordability and accessibility and getting it covered by insurance.
Yeah, I would love to see more help on that regard. But at the same time, I try to remind myself, we don't want to wait, right? We don't want to wait for it. I'm not saying that we are waiting and that we should be waiting, but I'm also trying to remind myself, when my son was diagnosed, the endocrinologist started talking about these automated insulin delivery systems, and they seemed like they would never get here.
Yeah.
And in the last 4 years, 6 years, as you said, people who use insulin pumps pretty much use AID systems.
Right. Yep.
So it gets here. So I'm very optimistic, but boy, the waiting is hard.
Yeah.
Again, we could talk about so much of this for so long. Let me ask you about some newer things that we've kind of heard around in the background, but I feel like are bubbling up. Ketone monitoring, which I have to say, David, years ago, I would have said, like, why do we need that? Just you can check. But with some medications and other factors, this really has become something to look for. What are you looking at in terms of ketone monitoring?
I agree with you in the sense that initially I was pretty not impressed by continuous ketone monitoring. And I still don't think it's going to be a home run, right? The way I liken it to I think CGM is like the iPhone, right? The iPhone was like a transformative product where, once in a lifetime potentially. Whereas I think CKM is going to be something like the iPad, where it's like, it's really cool. It's nice to have, but if you had to pick one, no doubt you're going to grab your iPhone every time. And you're right. There is some benefit to monitoring for ketones for the risk of normo or euglycemic DKA, which is increased by medications like SGLT2 inhibitors like Invokana and Jardiance or Farxiga, which are type 2 drugs that can be beneficial for people with type 1. Interestingly enough, incretins like Ozempic and Mounjaro also slightly increase your risk for euglycemic DKA, but in my clinical practice, it's essentially a non-factor. But my response to that was always like, well, you don't really need, it's kind of weird if you're making a device that's monitoring for side effects of another drug, right? That's not a compelling enough case. The real compelling argument, in my opinion, for continuous ketone monitoring is some data that was presented by Abbott, I believe, in the past couple of years, which is showing that they're able to detect pump failures faster than blood sugars, or I guess I should say DKA from a pump failure faster than hyperglycemia. Because what happened, because they basically suspended insulin in people with type 1 diabetes, and then they monitored their ketone levels and their blood sugar levels, and they found that the ketone levels started to rise before the actual blood sugar started to rise. So you can actually use ketone as an earlier warning sign that something is not right. And I think that is really, that was the first time where I was like, okay, I can actually see CKM being a big deal. Like I said, I don't think it's going to be a world changer, but if, say, Abbott gets it first, which I think they will, and the G7 is still out, then you might be like, oh, well, if this has 2 features, this has 1, why not go to the one that has 2 features, right? Or is monitoring for 2 things rather than 1 thing. So it's important, not life-changing, but not insignificant either.
I think, and this is not for 2025, but I could see a situation where you have a continuous glucose monitor that monitors many more things, right? Ketones. I know that they've tested for alcohol and, anything that you can measure interstitial fluid. So, you've got the Oura ring, which we've already talked about, measuring sleep. How much more important might it be to measure all these other factors as an add-on? I love the iPhone analogy. I think that's exactly right. That's perfect. Because these are add-on things that might be more important to some individuals.
Right.
As a marketplace, so we'll see. But if it's not all in one, if you need 2 different sticky things on your body,
the
that's
appeal
not
quickly
work.
drops off. Yeah.
And then let's talk about insulin, because we haven't really seen a lot of changes in insulin. A couple of years ago, people were talking about faster acting. I haven't really felt like that disrupted the marketplace enough. I know some people swear by Apidra and Fiasp, and that's great. Mm-hmm. But once weekly basal insulin is kind of coming because it's approved in some countries, but not here yet. And smart insulin, which I know I'm not supposed to call it that, glucose responsive insulin is way out there still. So let's start with the once weekly basal. Do you think approval is on the horizon?
I do. I think the next kick at the can is going to be with the Lilly product, which is called Efsitora. That's the generic name. As your viewers may or may not know, Novo had one, which is cleverly called a weekly, which is insane to me that they got that product name. That's
you say cleverly, I say bizarrely.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like it's like the license plate approvals, right? I feel like somebody did not put it together that AWIQLI was a weekly, because I was joking around with some Lilly people that it's like, how can you talk about Efsitora without saying it's a weekly insulin? And that's got to kill you every time you're naming the name of your competitor. So a weekly, which is the brand name of Novo's weekly insulin, is approved in some parts of the world, but it got denied by the FDA. So they kind of had to go back and they're going to have to resubmit it to the FDA again. So I think the next kick at the can is going to be with Efsitora, which is Lilly's product. I think there's a good chance it gets approved, But I think they will probably, or the world will probably try to establish its footing in the type 2 space first, because it is a huge paradigm shift. Because like even for me as an endocrinologist, when I first started reading about it, right, there's like a starting dose of 100 units a week. And that sounds crazy, but if you divide 100 by 7, it's like podcast brain where you can't think. Like it's like what, 13 units,
Right.
13 units a day, which isn't that much. But then if you're like, hey, take 100 units of this weekly insulin, it's kind of scary no matter what. And you have to get used to it and kind of normalize it. So I think a lot of that will happen in the type 2 population. But I think once we kind of wrap our heads around it and the market kind of understands how it works, where it's helpful, I think there is a really good market for it. Your audience is probably more sensitive to this, which is, I didn't really think about it until I was at a discussion with a pediatric endocrinologist. And he was like, I cannot wait for these products because I just have some kiddos who just have such a hard time remembering to take their insulin, or they don't want to take their insulin. But, maybe we can send a nurse over to their house once a week, or their parents can like get one shot in a week. And, it's not going to be perfect, A1C of, 6.5, but maybe that's the difference between an A1C of 13 and hospitalizations and an A1C of 9 and, staying alive. So I think it's a really important product. I don't think it necessarily is going to take the world by storm. I think it's going to be a really slow growth process while we understand it better. But I think there are certain use cases like that pediatric situation I just explained where it will be immediately impactful for type 1 diabetes. And then I think for the rest, it'll kind of trickle in. One thing that I always like to think about is pairing something like a weekly insulin with something like Luna Diabetes, which is that overnight automated insulin delivery system, right? That is kind of cool because then you're cutting down your daily insulin shot and you're still getting some automation overnight. So, I think as we understand it better, I could see it playing a larger role in people with type 1 diabetes.
Yeah. And I left out Luna from our discussion only because they're starting their clinical trials.
Exactly.
So
yeah,
they're
I don't
not
think
going to be
their approval will be next year. But maybe,
they are fascinating.
Yeah.
I
I think it's a really cool product because there's a lot of people that, as amazing as automated insulin delivery is, they just don't want to wear a pump all the time. And I get it.
Yeah. And if you missed our episode on Luna, go back and listen. But it is a device that you only wear overnight. And it's a pump that attaches like a thumbtack. It just pushes on. There's no traditional infusion set, which I have a very hard time. And if you listen to that episode, you'll realize I have a very hard time with the concept of this. So I was learning along with everybody else. Really fascinating. But I think that's what's interesting, right? Is we have all of these established AID systems and ways of doing things. And it took so long to get here. But now all of a sudden we're seeing disruptions and ripples and changes in what's possible because of things like smart insulin pens and CGM. And it's just amazing. So I'm really hopeful as we move forward. We didn't even touch on stem cell research and implantation and, all that kind of stuff because not happening in 2025, but probably moving forward. So, I'll continue to follow that. But what's very hard about doing an episode like this, and one of the things that's really fun about doing an episode like this is we definitely didn't talk about what's going to be the big deal of 2025 in diabetes. Like we just, you don't know, right? Something's going to happen. Something interesting is going to happen. A paper is going to come out or a device is going to work in an interesting way. So it's really hard. That's why I don't like to do too many predictions, but I like that we're looking at this kind of thing. When you talk to your patients, is there anything that they are really interested in right now? I don't want to put words in your mouth, but like they're, as you said very early on, they're engaged. They're coming to you like they have questions. So this is a population that is educated. What are they really focusing on?
Good question. I think it's probably unimpressive at this point, but I think people love carrying around less stuff. And what I mean by that is probably the thing that in my mind recently gets the most joyful reaction in my patients is like iPhone control with Omnipod 5. You know what I mean? Literally yesterday, I got an after hours call, which we don't get that often, from a patient. And she was like, my Omnipod 5 PDM broke. And she was kind of panicking because she needed her settings. And I was like, hey, do you use an iPhone? And she was like, yeah. And I was like, are you using the G6? Because I kept most of my Omnipod 5 patients intentionally on the G6. She was like, yeah. I was like, hey, I have great news for you. This couldn't have come at a better time. You can actually now download the iPhone app and control your Omnipod from your iPhone. And, she's like your average 25-year-old patient. Like she missed her last appointment and I haven't seen her actually in like 9 months or something. And, and so she had no idea. And she was like, what? Like I can control my Omnipod with my iPhone? And her mind was blown. And I get that reaction all the time in my patients. And I think they just love feeling less like they have this medical condition that causes them to have to wear, you know what I mean? It's just
Yes.
like, and it makes such a big difference. And so it's kind of boring in the sense that it's not.
Oh, I disagree.
exciting,
I think that's a
but
great one. I'm so glad you
yeah,
said that because this is a condition that is not only do you have to think about it all the time, but you got stuff on you all the time.
right.
And the freedom, it's funny. Obviously, everyone has personal preferences, but
Of course.
my son with a tubed pump loved the idea of he shoved his pump in one pocket, he shoved his
For
phone
sure.
in the other, giant boy cargo pants, and he was done. Sometimes
Yeah.
he remembered to take low treatments, but that was
Yeah.
it.
Yeah.
And so not having to schlep everything everywhere he went was a huge selling point. And I think that as that gets better and better, and is even some of these years and years ago, there was this question about, can we make the devices look less clunky? Can we
Mhm.
make them look less medical? Can we make human factors and something I'd never even heard of? Can
Yeah.
we do that research? And
Right.
these companies are, and they're responding and they're making devices that, I don't use one, so I can't really speak, but it seems to me like they are sleeker, they are better. You don't
Oh, for
feel like
sure.
you're
Like
carrying around a clunky
the
thing.
Mobi, still to this day, every time I see it, I'm like, that is so cute. I don't know why. It's just hard to like not have that reaction.
Yes.
So I try to grab a model for it every time when I talk to a patient about it, just so that they can like lay their eyes on it. And the funny thing, I was actually just telling some people yesterday that they have to figure out a way to market this. It's hard. You'll see what I'm talking about. But I'm surprised by how many of my female patients wear their pumps in their bra. And they love the fact that the Mobi is just so small and isn't like this huge box sticking out of their bra. And so, like I would never know this, but so many of my patients, like actually I would say most of my patients don't use the adhesive sleeve with their Tandem Mobi. They actually just will tuck it in their bra or, put it in their little tiny pocket in their pants. And it's just like, just those small things. Or I'll try to relate it to things that are very normalized now, right? So when I'm talking to people about the Mobi, I'm like, oh, it's so light now that you can just clip it to your shirt even,
Yeah.
and it's not going to feel that bulky. It's like those TikTok cameras or TikTok microphones that you see everybody walking around with. And so I feel like we're reaching this place where diabetes technology has advanced, that a lot of it is like starting to become almost like you're saying, it doesn't look medical anymore.
Yeah.
And I think that's such an important distinction. And, of course, not to mention the fact that they have to worry about it much, much less with automation, right?
Yeah.
The funny thing about technology is you can always say this is like the best time to have X. Like we'll be saying that for the rest of my life, hopefully, but it really is an exciting time.
It is. And I'll just give Omnipod a little bit of fair play in there too, because you see all the kids decorating their pods and making them look like they are not medical. And Omnipod has really leaned into that, at events and things. And I think that's great, rather than saying, don't do that. You're going to mess it up.
And social media, I think, has been a huge boon for normalizing these systems, because the reality is most people don't know, or many people don't know other people with type 1 diabetes. But when you're on Instagram or TikTok and you're seeing other people who are athletic, other people who look like you, other people who enjoy the things you do, like living life and displaying their pod or showing you that they have a pod under their shirt or whatever, that's awesome, because you're like, oh, okay, like normal people wear these things too. So yeah, what a time to be alive.
No doubt. Well, thank you so much for going through all of that with me. I'd love to have you come back and we can kind of measure how we did, or talk about other things, the surprise that I promise is coming. And we'll go from there. But Dr. David Ahn, thank you so much.
Of course. Thanks for having me.
You're listening to Diabetes Connections with Stacey Sims.
If you've got something you're looking forward to that we didn't talk about, please email me, Stacey@diabetes-connections.com. Let me know, or chime in the Facebook group. I'm going to try to read all of these in the first couple of episodes of 2025. Love to know what's on your mind. And I mentioned that we've got a big milestone for the podcast. In a couple of months, we will be officially turning 10. I launched the podcast in late May of 2015. And I guess we first showed up on apps and Apple and all that in June of 2015. So this is the 10th year of the podcast, but the 10-year anniversary of the launch is coming up. What should I do? What do you want to see? I'm curious if you have any feedback that you'd like me to consider, because I don't know, I can do some Instagram posts and buy some balloons for myself, but the podcast is for you as you listen. So I'm curious what you would like, if there's anything And I can't believe I did not know when I started this show that we would be going for this long and having this much fun and doing this much stuff. So thank you so much. I say that every week, but boy, do I really mean it. Okay, thanks to my editor, John Buchanan from Audio Editing Solutions. And thank you so much for listening. I'm Stacey Sims. I'll see you back here soon. Until then, Happy New Year and be kind to yourself.
Diabetes Connections is a production of Stacey Sims Media. All rights reserved, all wrongs avenged.